Yeah, let's start with that one.
Yes. My name is Jan Bosters, and I have a question to Hatem. Today it happens to be the Day of the Human Rights, and I thought, is the concept of the human rights of any influence on the discussion about the Palestine? I'm thinking, for example, of the differences in health and access to health between the different groups in Israel. Might awareness of that differences be helpful for the problem?
Thank you.
I think a number of frames can be looked upon in terms of human rights. Access to water will be one, access to health care, disproportionate access to education, right to travel, the ability to have free movement, the right to actually free airspace, because airspace is not free for Palestinians, the ability to have actually your land and the access to land uninterrupted by waste dumping by settlements and settlers, where they redirect their sewage to actually dump the sewage onto Palestinian lands. We're experiencing actually basic access to food. In Gaza, actually, we have a stunted growth among children because of a reduction in calorie intake, where it's the only place in the world where actually the kids are becoming shorter as a result of the reduction in their calorie intake. A high percentage of kids also have experienced post-traumatic stress syndrome, which also falls into the whole aspect of the enforcement of the 4 Geneva Convention, because Israel is responsible as an occupying power for the well-being of the society. So there's so many different pieces relative to the human rights that could actually be brought to fore. So I agree with you on that.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes. Stand up, please.
I have a question for Hatem. What is the position on the neighbor countries? What are the newest developments on supporting the struggle for Palestine?
So the latest developments in terms of supporting the struggle in Palestine in neighboring countries.
It is the case that the conflict in the region have completely reshaped the solidarity and the support for the Palestinian. In the Arab world today, the access of alliances are set up for a conflict, or the conflict with Iran have taken precedent on the alignment and the deployment of resources to confront Iran as the #1 threat to the region. And in that, many countries are aligning themselves with Israel because they see it as a strategic ally in the confrontation with Iran, which results structurally is that the Palestinians are seen as an impediment, or if not an impediment, they're seen to be not as a strategic investment at this particular time. So that's the case presently in terms of the region and what the regional alignment looks at. The financial part of the question also is that massive resources have been redeployed away from supporting the Palestine struggle, whether in the humanitarian level or even at the more long-term level. So that is a direct consequence. We began to see this from the Iraq war, but now definitely the Syria conflict have created a complete total realignment away from Palestine as the central strategic case or issue for the Arab world. And then the Muslim world also fits in within that same regional topography.
Thank you. I think, yes, should we go to the question from the live stream first, or you want to take this one?
It's okay, I see no problem. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question maybe more related to contemporary politics. And how do you see, Professor Hatem Bazian, like the relation of the right-wing rise in Europe and also in the US and Islamophobic sentiments, and how does it relate to like the issue of Palestine and like the kind of the liberation struggle in Palestine.
Thank you. So the rise of the extreme right in the West, and how does that relate to Palestine and the struggle?
Let me speak about Islamophobia in particular, and how the increase or the promotion of Islamophobia is connected to the support for Israel, and how that also is being connected to criminalizing or targeting Palestinians. In the studies that we did both and published in the American Studies Association Journal, 75% of the funding for the Islamophobic industry comes from pro-Israel sources. And this is being deployed with a very strategic goal to neutralize and push Arab Muslim Palestinians out of civil society, so they would not contest the domestic policies as it relates to Israel. And the stoking of Islamophobia through the right wing was a strategy, because some of those who are committed to Israel viewed that the left wing is basically becoming increasingly hostile to Israel. So they shifted their resources to actually entangle and stoke the right wing, and we see some of that occurring. If there is what you call a cookbook, you would see that taking a supportive, an extreme supportive position toward Israel is one of the hallmark of the Islamophobic and the right wing. And I think they rode Islamophobia back into legitimacy and into mainstream political discourse at a time where they've been completely marginalized after the Second World War. So in this sense, there's a convergence in the pro-Israel discourse with stoking Islamophobia and consolidating some of the gains of the right wing that have a commitment on the one hand to anti-immigrant, anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, but also have a pro-militarist hawkish policies that feeds into consolidating support for Israel, and I think we're witnessing and seeing that dynamic is taking place. And I think we need to speak of it and expose it as often as we can. It's not surprising that Wilders will go to Israel to try to brush his credentials in supporting Israel, and he doesn't see this as a disconnect, but see it as a continuity. And it's not surprising that he also gets invited to the United States by some of the major Islamophobes who are basically main supporters of extreme pro-Israel discourses. So if you talk about Pamela Geller, Stephen Emerson, Daniel Pipes, David Horowitz, all of these that are leading Islamophobes, Frank Gaffney, are all stoking the right wing because they feel that they could strike an alliance in there. My critique to them is the following, that the right wing has an equal opportunity when it gets to power. And today they might be comfortable in aligning with some pro-Israel voices in the West and targeting Muslims, but as soon as they get into power, you trash below their suits and you find an anti-Semite there ready and standing. And I think we see some of this in the US after Trump's election, right? The same group that were comfortable in expressing their hatred toward Muslims, it's just a switch of a button, they immediately began to express anti-Semitism. You see it in Austria, you see it in Switzerland, and you see it in Germany. And I say, stoking this part of Western society and stoking that part of the right wing, at the end will come to bite your own interests domestically in some of the countries that you're involved in. So that's my, at least my advice to them, is that if you think that this is the way to protect Israel, even if you want, I would say that you're mistaken in the long run.
Thank you. Question?
There's a view that Palestine is already being sold
basically before it's actually become recognized as a state. I think Ali Abu Ni'ama writes a chapter in his book. Yeah, he writes a chapter in his book called Neoliberal Palestine, and he details how this is taking place, and then he compares it to the South African model. And I guess either of you could answer this question in terms of, imagine tomorrow Palestine is recognized by the whole world. We have, you know, Bantustans. We know what the situation is. What does this mean? How should we look at this?
If I'm thinking about what Ali is critiquing, is the economic modality that has been adopted by the Palestinian Authority. And as a result of the Oslo Agreement, there was a twinning of the Palestinian economy into the Israeli economy, and twinning the Israeli economy to both the Egyptian and the Jordanian economy to create a new elite that is vested or invested in the new economic modality. In addition, the United States foreign aid to the various participants in the peace process, Jordan, Egypt, Palestinian Authority, as well as Israel, and also some other countries that have also gave recognition to the peace process, Morocco, Tunisia, even Mauritania and others. That framing is to create a new economic order, neoliberal economic order. And as such, what he's referencing essentially is that the new elite that is in there at this point is totally vested in this structure that was set in motion post-Oslo. So it's not a matter of saying that it's being sold, it's critique of what has developed, and we need to be aware, in essence, of what I call the concept of the golden cage. And the golden cage is there, and Palestinians need to be aware of. Not every economic development is a desirable economic development, because you might get some economic return, but essentially is vested in constructing the cage that is going to derail your possibility of having sovereignty, independence, self-determination, because you're entangled in all these economic modalities that are there. So I think that's what Ali Abu Ni'ama is referencing.
Thank you. Just a small follow-up question, Hatem. Do you think it is a realistic scenario that in the coming years there will be some sort of recognition of a Palestinian state, also from countries such as the Netherlands or the United States, but that we will see a neoliberal plunder?
Well, again, there are things that we have to be aware of, and not what you call take an absolutist view of it. Is it positive to have a recognition of Palestinian state? It is positive and it's important. Is it the end? No, it is not. It is a beginning. So we should not be what you call a zero sum, that either I see tomorrow that is going to be a free Palestine and from A to Z, and therefore I'm not going to take any tangential gains. We are in a prolonged struggle, and every measure of success that is coming as a result of our struggle, not because somebody all of a sudden woke up, drank Starbucks, and resolved there is Palestine. Every gain that we made is a systematic gain as a result of pressure, mobilization, and transformation that we need to take and then build on it in such a way that we know where we are and what directions we are taking. So that's probably my advice of how to approach that question. Is it important for the UN to recognize Palestine state? They should have recognized it long time ago. It's actually, if you want to look at 181, it should have been a state from the get-go. But the fact that they're pulling and pushing and so on is because Zionist pressure, AIPAC's pressure upon the United States government, AIPAC's pressure or the lobby in various countries want to prevent even the name Palestine from being listed. So even if you stand there and say Palestine, that for them is a problem, because you are asserting a name that should have been erased. And the fact that that name is being structurally implanted in a highly distorted global system should not be taken for granted. It's because you struggle to make that the standing statement of a noun that is being placed in the discourse.
Thank you. We received a couple of questions from the live stream. Some of them will be asked by Nur Zaman. First, one for you, Sandew. And it goes as follows. It's quite a long question, so bear with us, and maybe you need to summarize it. In the Netherlands, the Second World War has a mythical status. We are told to believe that it is the worst suffering humanity has ever been through. And it starts very early at primary school, basically, this teaching.
From early primary school up until the end of high school, we are basically traumatized during history class about the events in Europe in the 1930s and the 1940s. Can you comment on this? And is it true that there was so much suffering? How bad was, for instance, the Hungerwinter compared to the war in Iraq? And also, is it useful to demystify this? So a couple of questions. Comment on the traumatization, as this person calls it, and how bad were these events, for instance, the Hungerwinter for the Netherlands compared to the Iraq War?
Okay. Now, first of all, the occupation of Holland was an occupation by a fascist nation. So fascists occupied Holland. So naturally you have to acknowledge that suffering there. You can't say, oh, because we have a critical view of Nazism and of Dutch colonialism, you don't acknowledge fascism in Holland. That would be crazy, you know. So there was a struggle of the Dutch, especially the Dutch working class, led by the communists, by the way. In the Second World War, the communists were one of the major forces in fighting fascism. So it's beyond doubt that the Dutch suffered from fascism. The next thing is, when the Dutch were liberated from fascism, they exercised fascism in Indonesia. So just after the liberation, they sent 60,000 soldiers in Indonesia, which killed 150,000 Indonesians. And one of the captains there, Captain Westerling, did ISIS type of things in Indonesia, beheading people and doing what ISIS is doing in Syria, they did in Indonesia. That is the link which is missing in Dutch education. That the liberation from fascism enabled the rise of fascism in Indonesia by the Dutch. I think if we would write history, rewrite history, that is what should be in the books. But when we commemorate the Dutch liberation, that should be part of the commemoration. That when we commemorate the liberation of Holland on the 5th of May, we should also commemorate what it led to in Indonesia. It's not just rewriting of history, it's also the commemoration of it. So then there's another thing, which is the question of how the Dutch collaborated with fascism. And the collaboration with fascism was done by people who are now in the extreme right. There is a link between the old fascists of the NSB and the people celebrating Wilders now. Because in the anti-Semites of the 30s went through the different political formations in the 60s until the NVU and all these kind of fascist types. So there is a legacy there. Then while the KKK celebrated Trump, the extreme right celebrate Wilders. And these are the links I think we should make when we are talking about World War II and the suffering of the Dutch.
Just thank you for your answer. You actually answered another question that was also asked. But just to come back to the long question that I just asked you, the question ends as follows. So how it says that in the Second World War, the worst suffering humanity has ever faced was experienced. And then the questioner continues and says, how bad was, for instance, the Hungerwinter compared to the war in Iraq, it is said. And is it useful to make these comparisons and to demystify this if necessary?
Well, there are two levels. Look, on a level of emotional human suffering, you can't compare. For the victims, it doesn't matter. When you are suffering, it doesn't matter what the causes of the suffering. And you won't be able to compare your suffering with another suffering in terms of, you've got my leg, I've got 2 legs, and your 2 legs is worse than my 1 leg. It's not the type of morality we want to support. So I wouldn't go into the competition of suffering. Right? I think it would be immoral to do it like that. But we can compare historical facts of how structures and systems were set up, and how one system was more intrusive, intensive, and led to much more death. For example, the transatlantic slavery, compared to the Holocaust. The Holocaust had 6 million dead. The transatlantic slavery resulted in 300 to 500 million dead. For the individuals, it doesn't matter, right? But for the system, it matters. Because in the one system, it leads to the whole denial and of racism, the rise of racism, the rise of a knowledge system, an economic world system, which was not there for the Holocaust. Right? So then we could say, but look, colonialism was much more worse than the system which the Nazism had set up, not only in terms of duration of time, but also in terms of the economics, political, social, cultural, knowledge, scientific system. It is there, the facts are there. So I'm saying this not as a competition, but as a way to understand how the system works. For a Palestinian who lost his mother or father during the bombing of Gaza, that suffering is not different from a Jew who lost his mother or father during the Holocaust. So on the individual level, you can't do the comparison. It is there for everybody.
Thank you. Other questions I see from the audience? Yes, let's get to that one. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm Jazairi. My question maybe have to make with the last question about the rewriting of the history, maybe to Sandew and also a little bit to Hatem. It should also be translated to first to the schools books, to our children, to teach that to our children. And who is going to do that? When and how? And are you both optimistic about that?
Thank you. Can we start with you, Hatem?
Well, at least part of the project that we're engaged in is to rewrite parts of history that we're concerned about. So this is one attempt in terms of this book. We also have a discussion, at least with Ramon, Salman, and a few others, of writing the last 150 years to 200 years of Arab Islamic history.
Those are the people involved with the decolonial
summer school, yes, and decolonial discussion. Because that's a project. The history that we have in our hands is basically the colonial, post-colonial nation-state formation that took a point of departure, the problematizing of the pre-colonial period, in order to create a trajectory that gives rise to the structure that we're having. So that's another project that we need to undertake. How would that filter to the curriculum? That's going to be one of the biggest challenges, and I don't want to downplay it. It requires writing the curriculum to appropriate age level. It requires political mobilization for the bodies and the institutions that actually adopts the curriculum, and usually those are localized in nature. You have to have an impact on the national framing and how that takes place. So it's a long struggle in order for us to get from where we are right now in attempting to begin to just rewrite the broad strokes in terms of history, and then how that translates into the curriculum. At the small level, I think communities can be very empowered in rewriting some of their own particular aspect or particular narrative. And I think if you look at some of the African American experiences, we're creating their own schools, and with that they're creating their own curriculum in order to create a different worldview for the kids as they're growing up, that actually began to shift from problematizing and racialization of the black subject to actually to move to actually having black feeling, not only that they're full of human being, but actually to think of black as being beautiful and actually to be assertive. That went through a process of transformation at the local level for education, and I think both the Nation of Islam and somewhat to the Black Panther played a major role in this. So when we often think of, let's say, the emergence of Muhammad Ali, we think of him just because he emerged as a boxer. He did, but he also part of a larger environment that made possible for that transition to occur and for him to be the person that is able to speak and to confront the powers at the time that were attempting to suppress and marginalize him. So that's the type of work that we need to do from the local community level to the larger narrative of rewriting history.
Thank you. Sandew.
Yeah, let me paint a picture as I see it in how new history would be written. I think you have one level which is theory, developing decolonial theory, which goes into the analysis of what is science, what is methodology of science, epistemology, all kinds of things which doesn't reflect the rewriting of history yet, but develops a theoretical basis. A lot of people are doing work in this. Ramon Grossvogel is one of them, but there are many others. Then the second is using that theory in actually rewriting the history, like Hatem is doing in his book, and we are doing in the series Decolonizing the Mind. Then you have the knowledge which is produced. Then the next step is how to translate that knowledge into other levels of education, which goes in the educational system, in the primary and secondary schools. But the educational system is controlled by the state. So there is limitation there. For example, suppose a Muslim child tomorrow in the secondary school would say, I want to have a spreekbeurt on the Nakba. You know what happens in England? They report him to Prevent. And then suddenly he's a potential terrorist. So it's a censorship type, you know. So then you know the limitations of the formal educational system. So where do you go? You go outside the formal educational system, and then there's a whole world there. A lot of the critical education is not through the formal education. It's through social media. For example, take Muhammad Ali. You know, when somebody asks him, what do you think of Al-Qaeda, people having the same religion as yours? And then he answered, what do you think of Hitler having the same religion as yours? You know, which that type of argument are arguments that people look at YouTube and they use it in the conversation. So I think that a lot of this work, which is being done by activists, for example, Praveen is rewriting history of the Surinamese Indian in Suriname in terms of the struggle against colonialism. So what they do, they take one freedom fighter, her name is Titri, they write a song about it and they put out a video song. There's a statue of the guy who killed Titri, a white guy, and they want to replace that statue by the statue of him. So these are, when you do that, it's not just an act of replacement, it's the education behind it. Like the Rose Must Fall movement, it's the education behind the statue. You know? So the way to educate people is not only through the educational system, it is through the struggle itself that is a form of education.
Thank you. Sorry, you can ask a question. Just a small clarification. Spreekbeurt is a presentation that you do at school, and Prevent is a project in Britain that that makes it mandatory for teachers, amongst others, to report students to authorities, students whom they suspect to be terrorists, for instance. And there are criteria, and having a particular presentation can fit those criteria. And I think a similar project is currently being developed by the Dutch government. So the teachers' union is opposing that at the moment in the Netherlands, and they're negotiating it with the governments. More questions from the live stream?
Yeah. I have a question from someone who said he was born in 1964. To make it clear, it's a little bit long, so it's for Mr. Hatem. In Holland, there is still a national feeling of guilt towards the anti-Semitism as a result of the Second World War. So far, we didn't learn a lot in our history books at school concerning what happened in the Arabic part of the world after the Second World War, or even before this war. So again, when it comes to creating awareness and reaching any positive steps toward a better situation, where to start? With all due respect, but reaching the average person in the street and or the working class is a lot harder than reaching out to academics or students. And from my point of view, no matter what background, it is in all our interest and most certainly the future of our children that this world is moving towards a better position, where this is a good place for all of us. What is happening at the moment is exactly the same what happened before in the late 1930s, with the difference that this time it isn't about Jewish people or vulnerable minority population, how to turn the situation in this present time around. It is of major importance to reach the average person in the street if we want to stop this train going into the wrong direction. We are already facing politicians who remind us of Hitler or Nazi regime.
Thank you. I was interrupted, so I cannot repeat the question. I will have to ask you to repeat the bits of the question.
That's like I have to read the book.
Yeah, basically, yes. I'm not doing a good job as a moderator. I'm sorry.
Are we living in the 1930s period, and what do we need to do in order to change the period? I think we are experiencing a moment in history where there's a configuration, a right-wing configuration that is pushing and have claimed civil society. I say that civil society has been claimed by political bullies, and these bullies have captured the imagination of people that have been beaten up for economic displacement, social displacement, almost a decrease in their ability to have a normal standard of living, and they've been very skilled in stoking that fear by bullying segments of the weakest part of the society: immigrants, those who don't have papers, refugees who are displaced from their own ways. And I advise people, at least in the Muslim community in the United States, that bullies are the same. Meaning that the bully in the schoolyard who wants to steal your lunch is not going to stop unless you confront the bully. Because if you give him or her your lunch, the next day they're going to come to ask for your jacket. If you give them their jacket, they're going to get your bag. And at a certain point you have to decide that you need to stand up, because every day you're getting bunched every day for your lunch, for your jacket, for your bag. And at the moment that you need to decide to stand up and get few of your friends, the bully will actually, like any other bully, will withdraw from the fight. So what we have right now is all of us are being called to civil society by bullies, but we are opting not to actually to do what is needed in order for us to confront them. And therefore, what I tell people is that you need as soon as possible, if not yesterday, the day before, to begin to develop coalition and alliances with people that are being bullied, right? Which means that you need to close rank. For us in the United States, many people want to be what you call, they want to integrate, they want to be privileged whites. You're not going to be privileged white, so you need to actually ally yourself with those who have the ability to actually give you a long history. So developing alliances with African Americans, developing a strong alliance with the Latino population, developing an alliance with Asian Americans. Collectively, we could make a major difference, and we could push the bullies out of civil society. But it requires some really deliberate and patient work in building alliances at the local level, and to reshape the strategy that was used by the bullies in order to claim civil society. They went local, and they were able to capture local seats in election. They were able to take over different state bodies and to mobilize them for their own narrow agenda. And I think that's what the type of work that is needed. There's no other work that's going to do it. Right? You're not going to wake up tomorrow and think that Wilder is going to go on TV and say how nice you are Muslims. If you think that's what's going to happen, then you're deluded. Is he going to get up and tomorrow and say, you know, you guys are bringing us the best food, I love falafel and all that? If you think that's what he's going to do, you are deluded. The faster and the quicker you realize this, the more you are able to push the bully and reclaim the civil society. And that's, I think, what is needed from communities here in the United States, in Britain, or in the upcoming election in France with the complete shift to the right. And that's what is needed. I think a lot of people are so afraid that they're deciding to stay home and watch TV. Right? If you do this, I think Wilder is just so happy. Marine Le Pen is so ecstatic. Trump is going to tweet at you, watch more TV because, you know, we have a product as a president. Right? And the more you watch, the more he's running to the bank. So you need to realize that what type of work is needed. And I think to come out of that fear, daydreaming, and to realize that you have a lot of opportunity in front of you.
Yeah, let me add a few things here. I know that the current situation worries a lot of people, and that worry sometimes goes into fear, and with fear comes uncertainty, and in the end of the day, if fear overcomes you, you get paralyzed. So one of the things is that we should realize that history doesn't repeat itself. History, we see some repetitions of things, but history always develops in certain ways. So we look at the 30s, but at the same time, the 30s is not 2016. So we have to look at how things were in the 30s, but how the differences are here, so that we learn to understand what is going on, rather than to replicate some fear of the 30s is there, oh God, where are we going? The second thing is, we could learn indeed from the 30s. One of the things we can learn from the 30s is the question of how Hitler was able to come to power. And we know that one of the things is the disunity at that time in Europe of the working class. Because the Trotskyists were fighting the Stalinists were fighting the anarchists were fighting, they all were fighting each other rather than, they didn't develop the mechanisms to agree to disagree and still work on other things. That culture of being able to have differences of opinion and not killing each other, that culture was something we have to learn. And I think one of the greatest things of the struggles of the blacks and the Latinos and in the decolonial struggle is that those mechanisms are being developed. One of my critique of Marxism and the socialist movement is that comrades killed each other, that they didn't develop these mechanisms. And I think that once we are there and say, look, we need to bring people together who are activists and are standing against each other in certain points of the debates, but know they have common interests. That kind of environment is something we should create. Where activists don't talk to each other anymore, then we have a big problem, you know. And that kind of thing is one of the weaknesses we should overcome in order to build the unity, which is a hard thing to do.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes.
Yeah, so I have a question about the role of the Palestine Solidarity movement, especially in other countries than Palestine itself, and then especially the Netherlands, because that's where we are now and where I am active. So I think, like, always when I talk about why I get involved into the Palestine Solidarity movement, I think the biggest part is, of course, the oppression that we all see and that we know of in Palestine, and we have spoken to Palestinian people, and we know what is going on, and this is very bad, and we want to change this. Very basic. But the other thing is that we can see that the oppression in Palestine didn't come from Palestine itself, as was explained. It came from Europe, Great Britain. So then there are two trends sometimes in the Palestine Solidarity movement. One is saying we should support Palestine and leave the local politics from the Netherlands, from Europe, outside of this whole debate because it's about Palestine. So for example in Belgium, the N-VA, the very racist, fascist party, they tried for example to get into the Palestine Solidarity movement. So then we have the other trend which is saying, well, actually the case of Palestine is part of a much larger problem, as it's colonialism in general, and this needs to be fought, I think, in both sides, as the country where the colonization is happening, but also by the people of consciousness and the oppressed people in the home country of the colonization. So if we see that there are such big imperialist interests involved with Palestine, there are security interests like the whole economy of Israel and its security apparatus being sold to the Netherlands, where the Dutch police is being trained by Israel, etc., etc. We have the recent gas that has been found in front of Israel and in the land of Palestine. We have the political interests that are the same. And then we also see what has happened to South Africa, where, yeah, there was a huge move forward, but still we can conclude, I think, that there has not been total freedom been achieved for the black population in South Africa. So what actually is then the role of the solidarity movement outside of Palestine in confronting Zionism, confronting Israel, confronting imperialism in general? What is the way forward for the solidarity movement?
Thank you. This time I did do my job, I think. There are two trends that this person identifies. One is that what's happening in Palestine is bad, but it's a Palestinian thing. It isn't related to imperialism and outside powers. The other trend is, it is actually, you can see it, you can see for instance the connection between the Dutch security apparatus, the security apparatus of the Dutch state and Israel and Israeli trainers. So what should be then the role of the solidarity movement if we keep this in mind? And we have an example, I think, according to the person who asked the question, that is South Africa. You had a solidarity movement after the fall of the apartheid in South Africa. The black communities are still unfree to a large extent. So what is the role of the solidarity movement considering this information?
And I think in South Africa we can't say they're not free. It's that their attainment of full equality and also ability to control the economy, which is very important, is not there yet. So we don't get into a very narrowing of the spectrum of what took place. I think in here there's a complication. On the one hand, because you're engaged in a solidarity struggle to a particular struggle, how to be true and just to the requirement of the struggle, and simultaneously how to be principled in a transnational way. And that's a challenge that I don't think is unique to the Palestine Solidarity movement. We see it even in the United States, between what we have to focus domestically versus those who say that we need to do work in a transnational. And what I always favor is to think global and act local in all of the circumstances. So even if I'm engaged in Palestine, I don't separate it from my local context. So for example, the Israeli police the Israeli security apparatus does train the American police forces in various areas. So in that I intersect with movement to stop the militarization of the police, but at the same time I bring the Palestine dimension into the debate, into the discussion. So I'm consistent at the local level, but making sure that I'm also consistent to trying to have the Palestine context being in the larger frame and part of the discussion in that sense. So that has been the way that we deal, and I think so far in many of the areas we're involved in has bear fruit in this sense. Having said that, again, we are dealing with a global phenomena that is transnational in nature. You cannot isolate Israel, or in the sense some of the countries that are in alliance with Israel in the Arab and Muslim world, from the broader global military-industrial complex and the power and economic dynamics. And that becomes what you call the biggest challenge of all, of how to navigate activism at the local level while having those antennas constantly being in there. Because at a certain point, you could you could be, as a Palestine activist, have all the causes, and therefore you are really not having a particular impact. So you have to at least specialize without disconnecting from the broader picture that is there.
Maybe one thing to add to it. I think that in Holland, specifically, the question of Palestine has been mainly in the Muslim community, right? And there have been some efforts since 2 years ago to connect the Black Pete struggle with Islamophobia through the narratives of racism. Black racism and Islamophobia have the same common roots in colonialism. But on the activist level, to get the activists to know each other. Now, I think that it would be an idea to have the Students for Justice for Palestine link Palestine as a colonial narrative to transatlantic slavery and the struggle against black racism with the same narrative, and then have joint sessions on that. How does the narrative of black racism relate to Islamophobia through Palestine, if we take the lens of Palestine? And that is something which could be done at the universities where you are active, through lectures, through debates. I like the concept of debates more than the lecture. Debates between diametrically opposed people, not debates between people who like each other. That's not a good debate. People who hate each other should get into the debate. We have done those debates and we loved it always. So I think that using this kind of narratives could bring in both Islamophobia and Palestine and the rewriting of colonial history in one framework.
Thank you. I think, in a sense, this answers the question that we had from before the break about your input about the Dutch context. This is the final question, then. This concludes the program that we have for you today. Thanks to both of you very much.